April 1st, 1988, Fort Wayne, Indiana. A little girl walks out of her front door on a rainy Good Friday afternoon. She tells her mother she will be back in 10 minutes. She never comes back. And the man who took her from that street spends the next 30 years living 20 miles away, writing taunting notes to police, signing them with her name, and laughing. 30 years, and nobody could touch him. To understand how this happened, you have to understand Fort Wayne. In 1988, it was a mid-sized Midwestern city of around 170,000 people. Working-class neighborhoods, church communities, the kind of place where families spent Good Friday indoors and Easter Sunday together, and where children walked to each other's houses without anyone thinking twice about it. The Tinsley family lived on Pontiac Street in the north part of the city. April Marie Tinsley was 8 years old, a first grader at Fairfield Elementary School. She had a gap-toothed smile that her school photo captured perfectly, the kind of smile that made strangers stop and look twice. She was bright, curious, the kind of child who said hello to people she recognized and did not talk to people she did not. That afternoon, she asked her mother, Janet, if she could walk to her friend's house nearby to borrow an umbrella. It was raining lightly. Easter Sunday was the next day, and she did not want to get wet on the way to church. Janet said yes, it was a short walk, a street April knew well. She had done it 100 times. She walked out the front door and turned down the sidewalk, and that was the last time her mother ever saw her alive. A witness later came forward and told investigators what they had seen that afternoon on that street. A blue pickup truck, a white male in his 30s behind the wheel, and a little girl getting into the passenger side. Whether she was lured or forced, she got in, and the truck drove away from Pontiac Street and disappeared into the gray Indiana afternoon. When April did not come home that evening, Janet Tinsley called the police. Within hours, 250 Fort Wayne police officers and 50 volunteers were searching the neighborhood. They searched through the night. They searched through the next day. They searched on Easter Sunday. April was not found. 3 days after she disappeared on the morning of April 4th, 1988, a jogger running along a rural road near Spencerville, Indiana, about 20 miles west of Fort Wayne, spotted something in a drainage ditch beside the road. Yet it was April Tinsley. She had been there for at least 2 days. She was still wearing the clothes she had put on that Good Friday morning. One of her shoes was missing. The autopsy was straightforward in its brutality. April had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled to death. The cause of death was asphyxiation. She was 8 years old. She had gone to borrow an umbrella, and she had been taken, raped, and murdered by a man who chose her for no reason, except that she was small and alone, and she was there. DNA evidence was recovered from her clothing near the site where her body was found. Investigators recovered one of her shoes and a shopping bag. A composite sketch of a white male in his 30s was distributed across the region based on the witness description of the man in the blue truck. Investigators worked every lead. They interviewed hundreds of people. They ruled out suspect after suspect. They followed tips that went nowhere, and then the trail went silent. 2 years passed, no arrest, no name, no justice for a first grader who had gone out to borrow an umbrella on Good Friday and never made it to her friend's front porch. And then he decided to remind everyone that he was still there. In 1990, a farmer in the Fort Wayne area discovered something written on the side of his barn, not sprayed, not scratched, written carefully in marker by someone who had stood there and taken their time. The message read, "I kill 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. Did you find her other shoe? Ha ha. I will kill again." Read those words carefully. He used her full name. He referenced the missing shoe, a detail that had never been released to the public. He misspelled the word again, and he ended it with ha ha. This was not guilt speaking. This was not remorse. This was a man standing in a field in Indiana 2 years after murdering a child, writing on a barn wall because he wanted the police to know he was still free, and he found it funny. He was taunting them. He was taunting the community. He was telling Fort Wayne directly, "I am still here. I am still walking around. There is nothing you can do about it." And he was right. Fort Wayne did not forget April. Her face stayed on flyers and billboards and television segments for years. Her mother, Janet, never stopped talking about her, never stopped pushing, never stopped carrying the weight of a parent who does not know what happened to their child in those final hours and may never fully understand it. The city held on to April's memory with both hands, but holding on to a memory is not the same as finding an answer. And for the next 14 years after that barn message, the case produced nothing. Then in 2004, he struck again, not with a new victim, with more notes. Investigators were called to 3 separate locations in the Fort Wayne area. At each location, someone had left handwritten notes in the same taunting style as the barn message 16 years earlier. The same misspellings, the same references to April by name, the same deliberate cruelty. And at each location, alongside the notes, the killer had left used condoms. He left used condoms with notes referencing a child he had murdered 16 years earlier. One of the notes read, "I am the same person who kidnapped and rape and murder April Tinsley. You are next. You are next." He was not done. He was threatening to kill again. And he was leaving his own biological material at the scene because he was absolutely certain, after 16 years of freedom, that it would never be traced back to him. He was wrong about that part, just not immediately. Investigators collected everything from those 2004 locations. The notes were analyzed, the condoms were tested, the DNA from those condoms matched the DNA recovered from April's clothing in 1988. The same man, confirmed. His DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, and nothing came back. No match. He had never been arrested for anything that required a DNA sample. He was not in the system. He had spent 16 years taunting law enforcement and leaving biological evidence behind. And the system that was supposed to catch people like him had no record that he existed. The case went cold again. In 2009, America's Most Wanted ran a segment on April's case and asked the public for tips. Tips came in and went nowhere. In 2015, Parabon Nanolabs, a DNA technology company in Virginia, produced a facial composite using the suspect's DNA, a prediction of what he might look like based on his genetic material alone. The image was distributed widely across Indiana. Nobody called in with a matching name. He was still invisible, still free, still 20 miles away. And then 2 things happened in the spring of 2018 that changed everything. On April the 25th, 2018, investigators in California arrested Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, using a technique called forensic genetic genealogy. They had taken his crime scene DNA and run it through a consumer genealogy website to find distant relatives, then built a family tree backward until they arrived at his name. The arrest made international headlines, and 2 weeks later, Fort Wayne police detective Brian Martin picked up the phone and called Parabon Nanolabs. He asked them if they could try the same approach with April Tinsley's case. They said yes. Calm Parabon uploaded the suspect's DNA profile to GEDmatch, the same genealogy website used in the Golden State Killer case, a website where ordinary people share their DNA to find lost relatives. The results came back with distant matches. 3rd cousins, 4th cousins, people who had no idea that by uploading their DNA to find family members, they had just connected their family tree to the murder of an 8-year-old girl in Indiana 30 years earlier. The lead genealogist on the case was C.C. Moore, one of the most experienced forensic genealogists in the country. She took those matches and started building family trees, hundreds of names wide, narrowing generation by generation, eliminating candidates, following the DNA logic forward through decades of births and marriages and deaths. 6 weeks after Parabon started working the case, Moore had her answer. She had narrowed the list of possible suspects to 2 brothers living in Indiana. One of those brothers was 59-year-old John D. Miller. He lived in Grabille, Indiana, a small, quiet town northeast of Fort Wayne, less than 25 miles from where April was abducted. less than 20 miles from where her body was found in that ditch in Spencerville. He had been there the whole time. His neighbors described him as secluded, often angry, a man who kept to himself and did not invite conversation. He had a wife. He had lived what looked from the outside like a completely unremarkable life in a completely unremarkable Indiana town. Investigators put Miller under surveillance. They watched him, they waited, and then they went through his trash. In Miller's curbside garbage, police found 3 used condoms. They collected them and sent them to the lab. The DNA extracted from those condoms was consistent with the DNA from the 2004 notes, and it was consistent with the DNA recovered from April Tinsley's clothing in 1988. 3 items from a trash can on the curb outside a house in Grabble, Indiana. That was all it took. 30 years of freedom, 30 years of taunting, and it ended with a trash bag. On the morning of July 15, 2018, Fort Wayne detectives and Indiana State Police drove to Grabille and found John Miller outside his home. They asked if he would come to the police station to speak with them. He agreed. He got in the car. He rode to the station. And when the detectives sat down across from him and asked if he had any idea why they wanted to talk to him, John Miller looked at them and said 2 words, April Tinsley. Not a question, not a denial, not confusion or surprise. He said her name like a man who had been carrying it for 30 years and already knew what this conversation was. And then he told them everything. He said he had planned to abduct a child that day. He had not specifically chosen April. He simply drove through the neighborhood and she was there alone, small, walking in the rain. He asked her to get into his truck. He drove her to his trailer. He raped her. He strangled her to death. That night, he drove her body out to the ditch near Spencerville and left her there. When he got home, he found one of her shoes in his truck. He drove it out and threw it in another ditch. He confirmed the barn message. He confirmed the 2004 notes. He said all of this out loud in a police station without being asked twice. Sad John Miller was charged with murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement of a victim under 14 years of age. On December 21st, 2018, he stood in an Allen County courtroom and pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. He would never be free again. April's mother, Janet, was in that courtroom. She had waited 30 years for this moment. She had feared for years that it would never come. When Miller was arrested in July, she told reporters she was numb, standing in that courtroom in December, watching him plead guilty. After 30 years of living without an answer, there are no words adequate for what that feels like from the outside, and there are certainly no words adequate for what it felt like from the inside. Sad John Miller died in prison on September 4th, 2025, at St. Vincent Indianapolis Hospital of Natural Causes. He was 66 years old. He died in custody. He died having confessed. He died without ever offering April's family anything that resembles an explanation, because there is no explanation for what he did that could ever make sense to a decent person. In the Hoagland-Masterson neighborhood of Fort Wayne, where April grew up, there's a place called April's Garden. It was built in 2015 as a memorial to her memory. Pink magnolia trees, a bench with her name on it, a place where the community that carried her name for 30 years could go and sit with her. On July 28th, 2018, 2 weeks after Miller's arrest, a memorial walk starting at April's Garden was held in her honor. The people of Fort Wayne, Indiana, who had refused to forget an 8-year-old girl for 3 decades, finally had something to carry alongside her name, an answer, a name, a guilty plea, a sentence. April. Marie Tinsley was a first grader who liked to smile for school photos. She walked out of her house on a rainy Good Friday afternoon to borrow an umbrella from her friend so she would not get wet on the way to church. She did not make it to her friend's door. She did not make it home. She did not make it to Easter Sunday. The man who took her from that sidewalk spent 30 years laughing about it in notes he left for the police to find. And then a genealogy website, a DNA company in Virginia, and 3 items from his own trash can ended 30 years of laughing in 6 weeks. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. Every week, we go back to the cases that refused to stay cold, the ones where the evidence waited and the technology caught up and justice finally found its way to the right door. New episode every week.